We are studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, and in this chapter, Sri Aurobindo brings our attention to the reality behind the mind, of which the mind is an image, the reality that we name the Brahman. In the text of the Kena, the first verse began by pointing to that reality by setting a relationship with this experience of the world. What is it that makes the mind reach its mark? And so the mind here is as if inspired, guided by that which is beyond mind. By whom yoked moves the first life breath forward. So the life we experience here is impelled by that reality which is the life of this life, just as that is mind of this mind. And then it asks, by whom impelled is the word that men speak? So even the speech is finding its source in that. And our eyes and ears work because that sees, that hears. Although that is beyond mind, beyond this life, beyond this speech, beyond these eyes and ears. And so the second verse puts that in relation by answering the questions. That which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. And then the third verse of the Kena shows that is not just an exaggeration of this. It is not a mind which is superior. It is not a life which is greater. It is not a sight which is just enhanced. It is something fundamentally different and transcending. And it says in the third verse, there sight travels not, nor speech, nor the mind. That is, if we were to utilize these apparatus of our senses, we cannot get to that. So that is not just an exaggerated extension. We know it not, nor can distinguish how one should teach of it, for it is other than the known. It is there above the unknown. So it is not merely that it is different from what we know. It is not only that which we do not know. It is something fundamentally different and higher. It is so we have heard from men of old who declared that to our understanding. And then the verses 4 onwards, which then elaborate this relationship. Sri Aurobindo is commenting on this line of thought, this trend of the Kena Upanishad, when in the text we are reading, he says, the mind can only be aware of that as something which we indefinably are, not as something which it definably knows. For the moment our mentality tries to fix this something, it loses itself in the flux and the movement, grasps at parts, functions, fictions, appearances, which it uses as planks of safety, or tries to cut out a form from the infinite. So this is the text we had read last time, and immediately after, Sri Aurobindo elaborates on the relationship between the two. Behind the mind is this other, or Brahman consciousness, mind of our mind, sense of our sense, speech of our speech, life of our life. Arriving at that, we arrive at self. We can draw back from mind the image into Brahman, the reality. And it is this which we were studying. We saw what is meant by mind of our mind and sense of our sense. And we saw it in a series of layers disengaging from the function of our mind and seeing something beyond by which this mind can function. But the same exercise we can extend to these two other phrases, speech of our speech and life of our life. What exactly do we mean when we say speech? It is not the words we speak, but the impulse in us which makes us speak. So when we have something important to say, we know what we want to say, but we pause to decide how we are going to say it, the words we will use to communicate. And the words we use may change depending on who we are speaking to or which language we have to express. What I want to say remains the same whether I speak it out in English or in Tamil or in Hindi or in German. The actual vocabulary used and the sounds which emerge from my lips are not the speech that we are speaking of. It is this intention that is emerging to take on these forms. That is the true speech. The inspiration that we experience when we write poetry, you feel something pressing on you, pushing you to write, and then it takes on words. But the thing behind pushing you to want to write is the real impulse, which then translates into the words according to your vocabulary, according to the language. The same inspiration working through two different minds would take on different forms, and yet the source is exactly the same. That is the true speech, we would say. But when we contemplate on where does that come from, we didn't choose it. It came from somewhere that we are not conscious of. It is outside the domain of our consciousness, of what we know in our awareness. But if we trace it back all the way, it is not merely some unknown hidden state. There is behind it an impulse, a creative impulse, which is shared with the creative impulse of the universe. All creativity is an unfolding of a deeper, fundamental, essential creative impulse, which throughout this universe, by which the universe itself was born. And what do we mean by that? Where there was nothing, no space, no time, no energy, no form, not even a blankness, not even an emptiness. Into that, something expressed the sense of space, unfolded the sense of time, created a ground on which form could appear, and then unfolded a series of subtler and more gross forms until we have the experience of what we call the universe. But that which put out this impulse to create space, time, and the experience of form is itself therefore formless, spaceless. And its impulse therefore to create form is the original impulse, the original word, the original speech. And so when we speak of speech of our speech, it is to that the Kena Upanishad is pointing. And now the relationship becomes obvious. This speech is like a tiny, diluted, limited thread of a massive creative outpouring of that. And yet that and its speech are not of the nature of this speech. It is something more essential, something even we can say absolute, because it exists without a reference to anything else, without space, without time, without form, without any relativity. And therefore, that speech is something fundamentally transcending. And yet our speech is as if derived out of that. That can exist without this, but this cannot exist without that. And thus the Kena leads us to something from what we know to something which we do not yet know. The fourth phrase Sri Aurobindo refers to is a life of our life. And a similar kind of a meditation is possible on this theme. What do we mean by life? When we observe the functioning of human life, animal life, or plant life, we try to describe it by certain common characteristics. To this day, modern science has not defined life. It has only described certain common behavior traits. Life procreates. Life regenerates itself, heals itself, repairs itself, and so on. But is that really defining life? It is only describing a process common to life forms. When we go to a deeper appreciation, we recognize that life is not merely these processes, it is something which makes possible these processes. For example, when our biology is damaged, let's say there is a cut in the plant, in the tree, or on our hand, and there is a whole process of healing that begins. Something knows that there is a cut and that the cut is harmful and that it should be corrected. That knowing is not taking place in the material which is cut. It is taking place in a material behind the cut itself. In a material which knows the whole body and the balance of proportion of the whole body. In a tree, for example, if you cut one branch, the tree becomes unbalanced. It has more weight on the other side than this. And so it must hasten to grow something else along these branches to balance the weight. But when it has grown, it stops growing beyond a point to keep the balance steady. So there has to be something in the overall function of the tree which knows the whole tree, which knows the principle of the balance and can sense the balance, which knows what is good for the tree's growth and what is harmful. And the same in our biology. When it heals, it knows what it wants to become and can guide the cellular growth process to get to what it wants and then stop the cellular growth. So there is as if underlying a template of the form and a balance of proportions of energies and forces and functions, that everything is done just right. Cells have to grow and multiply, but if they grow too much, then it is cancerous. If they grow too little, then we wither away. What maintains the balance is this deeper energy, power, flow of life. And this itself, now we recognize, is not just happening in us. It is happening in the plants, it is happening in the animal, and it is the same thing happening in all of them. We also recognize it is the same thing happening in larger communities of people, plants, in a forest ecosystem. The way the balance of the ecosystem is maintained, often a precarious, subtle balance, is held by something which holds the entire forest life in its totality and knows exactly what is needed. When they observed, when a highway was cut through a forest, an entire half of the forest began to die out. On observation, they discovered that there was a particular species of insect which used to travel every year from one side of the forest to the other. It would pollinate the flowers there and then come back here to breed, and again go back to pollinate and come back to breed. When the highway was cut, the passage was blocked, and the other side of the forest ceased to have its pollination and it began to die out. Now, such a precarious balance held by a tiny creature which knows exactly to move across two extremes of the forest, what drives those creatures to do that activity? There are birds which fly across entire oceans. There are birds which fly from the extreme north all the way to the equator, from the pole practically to the equator, in a continuous flight without pause. Something is keeping these long distance connections of life in a balance, guiding it all. And so we begin to experience now a sense of a gigantic vast life energy of which we are a part. Our body is a tiny portion of that larger life. Not only is this larger life wider and more complex in the ecosystem of the earth, it also has a longer span of time. We recognize our biology is an outcome of our ancestral biology. My mother gave birth to a part of her own body which grew to become this body that I call me. But her body similarly emerged out of another body. And if we think in these terms, we see one continuous extension of tissue taking new forms of bodies, dropping the old forms and bursting out into new forms. But the life force in continuity is the same. And if this is the case in me individually, it is the case equally in the forest, in the whole earth. And now we have a vision of one life stream across billions of years, shaping the forms of the earth, keeping them in balance, and out of which all the smaller individual forms are carved out. This is then a greater sense of life. But continuing this trend, we see the entire universe as the manifestation of a single life energy which holds the whole universe in balance, unfolding the whole universe across time. That is life of this life. But when it has to guide the whole universe, just as our body life is supported by something which stands outside the tissue, so too the life of the universe stands outside the material of the universe. That knowledge, power, energy, pushing, guiding, molding the material of the universe, gross material and subtle material, that truly is life of our life. And it transcends all the limitations of space and time within which it works, but beyond which it exists. And so when we meditate on this theme, life of our life, speech of our speech, sense of our senses, mind of our mind, arriving at that, we arrive at self, capital S. We can draw back from mind the image into Brahman, the reality. So you see how in each of these four meditations, we are as if growing beyond, beginning with what we know towards that which we do not know, and yet there's a point beyond which the mind cannot proceed, but it senses a something further. So using the support of what we are and what we know and what we experience, the Kena Upanishad points to and leads us towards that which is beyond understanding of the mind. The mentality tries to fix this but loses itself, grasps at parts, and so on. When we conceive of something which is spaceless, of which space is an expression, the mind blurs. When you think of all space and all material in space as an expression of a single underlying energy, the mind can conceive of it like an ocean. But when you think that the energy itself is outside space, again the mind blurs. So we can use analogies to bring us as close as we can, but after a point, the mind has to fall back and a deeper intuitive sense has to simply feel this something beyond. And as a useful analogy which helps us break all sense of division is this. Consider the whole universe filled with this oceanic energy, creative energy, consciousness, knowledge. And all is an expression of that, like foam of water. And now try to cut this. How will you cut it? How will you create a division saying this and not that? The knife which you use is itself made of that. And as your knife moves through the air, creating a line, the knife itself is nothing but foam of the water underlying it, and the water remains exactly as it was, unchanged, even as the wave ripples through it. The knife itself is a phenomenon created by that. For that, there is no division, there is no this, there is no that, there is only oneness, indivisible. But the phenomenon it creates of forms can experience separation and division. And we can dwell on this idea, and you can feel how that deeper thing slips out of the grasp of the mind, and yet some deeper intuition can feel it and rest in it, and even feel satisfied that we have touched something real, something true. So this is what Sri Aurobindo now dwells upon, the relationship between that and this. But what differentiates that real from this apparent self? Or, since we can say no more than we have said already in the way of definition, since we can only indicate that that is not what this is, but is the mentally inexpressible absolute of all that is here, what is the relation of this phenomenon to that reality? For it is the question of the relation that the Upanishad makes its starting point. Its opening question assumes that there is a relation and that the reality originates and governs the phenomenon. So already here Sri Aurobindo gives us a hint that is the absolute of all that is relative here. It's again a theme for meditation. Take anything belonging to our world experience and then consider what would be its ultimate, highest potential or absolute. The play of colors that we experience. Take that to the maximum, the enrichment of the full range of color, extend it infinitely. Within each color, extend infinitely its variation of intensity, of saturation, of shades. And then you have the sense of infinity, intense infinities of colors, and beyond a point it blurs out. You can no more conceive of it. Consider the sounds we hear, and similarly, there's a point beyond which it becomes intense, massive, cosmic sounds, the entire supernova exploding, galaxies being born. Such could be gigantic sounds, but beyond a point when the whole universe is filled with vibration, all the infinity of vibrations blur into something which is indescribable. And so on. All things here find their absolute in that. Sri Aurobindo elaborates, obviously Brahman is not a thing subject to our mind, senses, speech or life force. It is no object seen, heard, expressed, sensed, formed by thought, nor any state of body or mind that we become in the changing movement of the life. But the thought of the Upanishad attempts to awaken deeper echoes from our gulfs than this obvious denial of the mental and sensuous objectivity of the Brahman. So the simplest thing we say is, it's not this, not this, not this. But that's not enough. We need something deeper. It affirms that not only is it not an object of mind or a formation of life, but it is not even dependent on our mind, life and senses for the exercise of its lordship and activity. It is that which does not think by the mind, does not live by the life, does not sense by the senses, does not find expression in the speech, but rather makes these things themselves the object of its superior, all-comprehending, all-knowing consciousness. So this all-comprehending, all-knowing consciousness does not need our sight to see. But the sight experience itself, it makes one of its playthings. It does not need our speech to manifest and express itself, but it makes possible this speech and other forms of expression as playthings, which it does not need, but which are part of its play here. And so with the life and even the mind. So Sri Aurobindo says beyond this, Brahman thinks out the mind by that which is beyond mind. It sees the sight and hears the hearing by that absolute vision and audition, which are not phenomenal and instrumental, but direct and inherent. Now each of these we need to elaborate. It thinks out the mind by that which is beyond mind. If you had to take a machine and teach a machine to do an activity, your own thought has to go well beyond the machinery's activity. I'm programming a computer. I need to be able to see not only what the computer does, but what it should not do, what it could do wrong, where it could go into an exaggeration or a loop, infinitely repeating itself. So my perception has to be much wider, and out of that much wider logic and understanding, I carve out a tiny piece which forms now the programming, the intelligence of the computer. Similarly, when Brahman carves out the human mentality, the power of the intellect, the power by which the intellect is created is something much vaster, much more comprehensive, which sees all that the intellect could do and all its limitations, and itself is above all those limitations, although it can do all that the intellect does. And so we find something very interesting here. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase in the Life Divine, the logic of the infinite. We are used to a certain logic of finiteness. This piece leads to that, and so on. But the thing which creates this chain of logic itself is infinite and sees in terms of infinite possibilities, carving out these chains. And that has its own way of thinking, forming, knowing, and it is completely different. So it thinks out the mind by that which is beyond mind. It sees sight and hears the hearing by that absolute vision, which are not phenomenal and instrumental, but direct and inherent. So again, when we look at our sight and experience of sight, can your eyes see the thing by which the eyes see? This is an interesting question. We can see things, but can we see the process of our sight itself? Can the eye turn upon itself? You can put a mirror and through the mirror see the reflection of your eyes. But what you are seeing is not the actual process of what is happening in the eyes. You are seeing a pattern of light which comes from a reflection. Can the eyes themselves see themselves and their working? No. Can you hear the ear's internal surface and eardrum vibrating? No. Can the mind itself become aware of the waves of its own movement? No. Because all of these are instrumental, phenomenal, meaning they have to have an instrument by which they can see. And the moment you have an instrument, the instrument is your limitation. So a sight which sees through the eyes and needs the instrument of the eyes cannot itself become aware of itself. Mind cannot become aware of itself as long as it uses the instrumentality of thoughts. And so he says, its sight is not phenomenal and instrumental but direct and inherent, and therefore the Brahman's seeing can see himself. The Brahman's thinking can know himself entirely without instrumentation in between. It's direct, it is inherent, it is in identity that it knows itself and sees itself. And because it sees itself and sees itself in infinite possibilities, that seeing becomes the manifestation of the universe. And our seeing is a part of his seeing. When we see a beautiful flower, it is because Brahman sees himself as beautiful flower. And our seeing is only a sharing in identity with a tiny stream and part and fragment of his infinite seeing. And then he says, it forms our expressive speech out of its creative word, that word by which it burst out the whole universe into manifestation. Of that, this speech is a tiny part. It speeds out this life we cling to from that eternal movements of its energy, which is not parceled out into forms, but has always the freedom of its own inexhaustible infinity. An infinite energy, infinitely flowing, always one and whole. And out of that, this life that we cling to is a tiny thread and fragment. Thus, the Upanishad begins its reply to its own question. It first describes Brahman as mind of our mind, sight of the sight, hearing of the hearing, speech of the speech, life of the life. It then takes up each of these expressions and throws them successively into a more expanded form, so as to suggest a more definite and ample idea of their meaning, so far as that can be done by words. To the expression, mind of the mind, corresponds the phrase, and this is from verse 4 onwards, that which thinks not with the mind, that by which the mind is thought, and so on with each of the original descriptive expressions, to the closing definition of life behind this life, that which breathes not with the life breath, that by which the life power is brought forward into its movement. And, Sri Aurobindo continues, and each of these exegetic lines is emphasized by the reiterated admonition, that Brahman seek to know, and not this which men follow after here. Exegetic line, which is coming from a deep understanding, advice, and it is reiterated each time. Each of these 5 things is repeated with this line, and an admonition, which is a warning. It is a warning, don't get lost with this phenomenal appearance. You must find that which is behind it. And Sri Aurobindo continues, neither mind, life, sense and speech, nor their objects and expressions are the reality which we have to know and pursue. True knowledge is of that which forms these instruments for us, but is itself independent of their utilities. True possession and enjoyment is of that which, while it creates these objects of our pursuit, itself makes nothing the object of its pursuit and passion, but is eternally satisfied with all things in the joy of its immortal being. So there are 2 things we have to pursue: true knowledge and true possession and enjoyment. And true knowledge is of that which forms these things and gives us this world experience. That is true knowledge. Knowledge of these is partial knowledge, limited knowledge of that. And true possession and enjoyment is of that. When we possess that, when we enjoy that, that makes the enjoyment true. Because that, although it creates all these objects of our pursuit, itself does not need anything, makes nothing its object of pursuit and passion. It is always complete, always satisfied in the joy of its immortal being. So that's why the whole focus of the Kena is pointing towards that, to know that and to possess that and enjoy that. The result, though, is not necessarily a denial of life. It doesn't mean that we stop enjoying this, stop possessing this, and stop this knowledge. It means that in knowing that, in having true knowledge, we are liberated from the appearances and the illusions, the deceptive appearances and the deceptive knowledge. In the true knowledge, all these things are seen in their true light. And in the same way, in the true possession and enjoyment of the divine consciousness, the whole world is seen as His play, as His expression. And now we can actively participate in the world, but from a poise which is a joy of immortal being. Never bound to chase after things, never bound to be dependent on the limitations of the world. Rather, we become ourselves conscious vehicles for His further manifestation in the world, recognizing that the world itself is in process of unfolding his infinite potential, unfolding his bliss, we become vehicles through which that unfoldment is speeded up and through which things are brought into expression which so far have not yet been expressed. And so we become participants in the divine manifestation. So it is towards such a goal that the Kena is leading us to. And Sri Aurobindo, in his own commentary, elaborates and makes clear these deep realities. So I suggest at this point we can read the verses which are referred to in this text and then meditate on it for the rest of the evening. We will continue the text which goes into the next chapter, titled The Supreme Word. And we will continue this in the session after about a month, beginning from the 17th of July, since I will be out of station in between. We will of course continue to show videos of earlier programs, talks, for those who are interested. For now we will only read the verses 4 to 8 in which these thoughts have been elaborated and meditate on them. Verse 4 of the Kena Upanishad. That which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. I will repeat it. That which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Verse 5. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. I will repeat. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Even the verse 5, Sri Aurobindo has a footnote. When he says that which thinks not by the mind, the same phrase in Sanskrit can be also understood as that which one thinks not with the mind. You cannot think of it with the mind. It also means at the same time that which does not need the mind to think. And the same with verse 6. That which sees not with the eye, but this can be also read as that which one sees not with the eye. So you cannot see it, but it itself doesn't need eyes to see. So that which thinks not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. I repeat. That which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Verse 7. That which hears not with the ear, and again it can be read as that which one hears not with the ear. You cannot hear that Brahman. But the Brahman itself does not need ears to hear. That which hears not the ear, that by which the ear's hearing is heard, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Again, that which hears not with the ear, that by which the ear's hearing is heard, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Verse 8. that which breathes not with the breath, that by which the life breath is led forward in its paths. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Again, the first phrase, that which breathes not with the breath, can be understood as that which one breathes not, you cannot smell it with the breath. That which breathes not with the breath, that by which the life breath is led forward in its paths. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here.